was brillig, and the slithy toves did gyre and gimble in the wabe. All mimsy were the borough groves, and the mome-raths outgrabe. Assalamu alaikum. My name is Hassan Radwan, and I will be your host today on Doubts Alive.
Doubts Aloud.
Oh.
Actually,
we'll keep that.
No, we can still use this.
Yeah. Welcome. It's great to have you with us.
Yes, thank you.
Yeah, welcome, Hassan.
Yeah, so you don't worry. The regular hosts are here, Francis, Ed, and Andrew, but we have a guest today, special guest, Hassan. And Hassan, you spoke at the last Unbelievable group, and I have to qualify myself now when I say that. I don't mean the last one, because that happened. We said
not
that
the end of time.
Not the end of time one. That would be probably what? Well, now
that'll be well attended, won't
now
it?
the elections happened. Is it the last one, Ed?
Well, perhaps.
Yes.
Yeah. Anyway, the season of madness leading up to the big day last week is passing. How was it for you, Francis?
Well, I wondered how people could believe in this man promising everybody gifts, going all around the country, making all these promises. And the thing about Santa Claus is pretty weird as well. I mean, it's not just Boris Johnson who's been giving this spiel, but a lot of people seem to believe in that nonsense.
Yeah. Yes.
Yeah. So after our season of communal madness over the election, actually, as we speak, we're still gearing up to Christmas madness, which we're all going to say we're going to love and really enjoy.
Yeah, I'm going to enjoy that piece of sort of fantasy fun. By the time this goes out, I guess people will either be recovering from the shock or delighting in the outcome, depending on what your political views were after the election, which for us as we're recording is just a few days away. So it's all quite fresh for us at the point of recording.
Yeah.
But by the time it goes out, it'll be kind of business as usual, I suppose.
Yeah.
But
we're the metropolitan elite who are all Remainers and in our little echo chamber of...
We are, yes, in our bubble.
And for anybody out there, like obviously listening from another part of the world, it's a very different in looking into little tiny Britain and its little issues. Interesting perspective. We talked about Beth out in California. They've got their own issues and we've got ours.
Yes.
Yeah.
In this way,
Yeah. Well, California is normally considered a kind of bubble within the US overall.
Yes, that's right.
Yeah.
It's kind of quite different than the main Bible Belt by a long stretch. But yeah, so there you go. So that's a little bit about right now. And so the next, this will be aired in the new year. So it'll be 2020, the futuristic.
Welcome to 2020.
Yes, 2020.
Yeah.
So when you're listening to this, it's all in that year. And it's like, wow.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, do you remember when we thought 2001 sounded weirdly like a number that we would never get to, and it was all going to be really, we were all going to be living in spaceships and...
Well, actually, Francis, you should mention that. And Hassan, this would be a very interesting question to ask you. But around that time, the Christian fundamentalist sort of books and everything was about this was the end. There were so many things about the so-called Christian rapture, end of the age happening in the year 2000. They even thought the IT situations of the computers were part of that. And so planes would fall out of the sky, Jesus would come back, or rapture Christians. And so that was quite something that I was very much aware of back in 2000.
Yes, I remember hearing about that.
Yes, I'm not sure if there was a Muslim version of that.
Yeah, not really. I mean, there are lots of hadith about the end times, and some of the more extreme groups like ISIS, for example, thought that they were kind of hurrying on the end time. There was going to be this big battle in Syria, and that's one of the reasons why they've got their magazine called Tablighi or something, which is where the battle between the Antichrist and we also believe that Jesus is going to come back and fight and fight the Dajjal, which is the Antichrist.
Wow!
So
this is so uncanny.
Yes, so we do have similar views, but I think majority of Muslims there wasn't a big fuss about it.
Right, in that sense.
I don't recall there being any.
In this sense, and then Ed, could you just explain a little bit about how we met Hassan and a bit about that original meeting that was so interesting for Hassan to speak out and also for us to experience?
I was really struck by it as I felt a kind of affinity of my kind of character is similar to Hassan's, a sort of wanting to get it right and do it best, and yet having this parallel set of experiences in a similar but different religion. And so it just blew me away, really.
Yes. And it did me. I think we've done loads and loads, 4 years of meetings now, and it was the most uncanny one for me in the sense that I just couldn't, it's just very, very hard for me to get my head around. And that's why we're going to have a very interesting discussion today. Very hard to get my head around that, Hassan, you went through mentally almost the same conditions and structures that my brain did in a sort of a deconstruction over a period of time, but it's not to do with the Bible and Christianity, it's to do with the Quran and Muslim faith. And I just found that the concepts that you were going through were just the same thing, but it's not the same faith, and it's just I couldn't really get to grips with how someone could feel that journey. But you did, and so that was very impacting for me. Francis, probably not so much.
Well, I couldn't have quite that take on it. I did find it fascinating, though, and I think it's worthwhile, all of us reminding ourselves, and I think that this came out through what Hassan was saying, that Islam is not some monolithic belief. It is a number of different interpretations, and just as there are interpretations across the Christian world, so there can be different ways of being a Muslim across the Muslim world.
Yes, that's right. Yeah. So
I think it's interesting about the way that we can relate to each other's experiences, and yet find it so strange that we can intensely believe our own set of myths that we were taught, and we find it very strange that other people believe these silly things which we see them as silly. And this is in-group bias, isn't it? This is our groupthink. So when I was going through that identity crisis and looking for meaning and so on, when I looked at Christianity, it seemed silly. I just said, how could anyone believe that? Whereas when I started looking at my own, sort of Islamic background, I thought, well, this makes much more sense. And it's simply because that was what I was fed from when I was very young, and so it became familiar. It's that in-group bias, isn't it?
It is. I found it. I heard Richard Dawkins talking to a Muslim journalist who was very, very good journalist, very, very rational and reasonable. And Richard Dawkins asked him outright. He said, "But don't you believe that Muhammad ascended to heaven on a white horse?" Something like that. And the guy just turned around and said, "Well, yes, of course." And it's like from my perspective, I thought, you don't really look at your own Christian beliefs or something. But even just now thinking that, I'm thinking, going to heaven on a white horse, that's just so crazy. And yet this guy said it like I would probably have said as a Christian, well, Jesus ascended up, disappeared behind a cloud, and no problem. What's the issue? And yet now I look at both as actually quite crazy, but I couldn't see it then.
It's like, if I was to say that there's a crocodile-headed God that's going to eat your heart if it doesn't weigh lighter than a feather on the day that the scales are set, you'll say, well, that's ridiculous, because we all find it ridiculous.
Yes.
Because that's not, that's something that is foreign to us. It's strange to us. We weren't brought up to that.
Yes.
Whereas I was brought up to think that this idea of a Trinity is ridiculous and absurd and irrational, and how could anyone possibly believe that? And it's just the way we are looking at things.
Yes.
Well, I think had the Egyptian religion survived until now, I think you would find Egyptian apologists for, Absolutely. I can't remember which god that was, saying, well, for goodness sake, don't be so literalist about it. I mean, this is obviously a metaphor. Do you not understand that the gods speak to us through metaphors?
Yes.
We find it so easy to defend and to rationalize our own absurdities. And we have this incredulity. We just can't understand why others can't see what we see. But of course, we're just looking from a different perspective and background. It's not about a rational examination. It's about our emotional attachment.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. It is amazing. So if we could then start then, Hassan, with your much as you talked, I suppose, about your journey in the in the Unbelievable Meeting, with the exception that we will sort of pause you en route. Sure. With various points from Francis, Ed, and myself, and so why don't you just launch into that so that anyone listening to this gets the picture of this particular episode.
Right. Well, I was born in England. My father was from Egypt. My mother is English, but she converted when she married my father. And I've got 7 brothers and sisters, and we were all brought up as Muslims. We weren't very religious. Sorry, as I say, I've got a little bit of a cough. And I, we didn't really practice very much as a youth and as a teenager. I was pretty much like anybody else. But I always had this identity that I was a Muslim. But my mum and dad didn't really force any sort of dogma on us. But I think a lot of people go through a crisis of faith, or they start to wonder about their identity. And for me, it was very much about identity. Who am I? What is the meaning of life? Where am I going? And I reached that stage around the age of 19. And that's when I started to, start look at religions. And of course, you think you're being rational about it. But of course, I did already have this emotional attachment to Islam. And so when I started looking at religions, Islam was the one that was familiar to me and attracted me. And there were a few things that happened in my life at that time. I had a friend, John, a very good close friend, and he became a born-again Christian. And he started talking to me about Jesus and the Trinity and original sin, and that Jesus died for my sins and so on. And as I say, I found that very, very strange because it was something that I was not familiar with. And but it did start me thinking about religion a bit more, and I started looking at my own religion. And then I remember Cat Stevens had become a Muslim, and that influenced me quite a lot. I thought, why would he sort of be attracted to religion? It was also 1979. This was the time of the Iranian Islamic Revolution, and that's I remember seeing the images on TV, and again, it made me sort of think, well, that's my religion. And then I remember a visit to Egypt and having long discussions with my religious uncle, and he started talking to me about Islam and made me read the Quran. And I think just something clicked. I just suddenly found the meaning that I was looking for. I was, what was the meaning to life? Where was I going? What was my direction? My identity. Whereas before I was confused. Am I English? Am I Egyptian? Now it kind of all fell into place. I could be, a Muslim, and it didn't matter, what country you come from, or which, whether you've got whether you're a doctor or a bus driver or whatever. You were part of this big ummah, this big community, and so I think it was an emotional thing and a community thing and an identity thing, and I definitely felt that it was the true religion. It was the one true religion. And I felt a desire to tell people, kind of save them from hell and make them understand. And it seemed to me that Islam was very simple, very clear. There is one God. He has no partners. He has no son. He has no father and daughter. And I often looked at English people and I thought, well, look, they don't really know about Islam properly, if they knew the true Islam and they understood it, they'd all just convert. And so
I've heard that before. Yeah.
I just felt it was my
Yeah, can I step in there
Sure.
on this? Because I think it's quite fascinating. It's around the same period, slightly just a couple of years later than my own sort of coming into accepting Christianity for myself with the same feelings. But I was definitely taught back then, or you imbibed within the Christian faith, that Islam, Christianity has a relationship with Jesus, and therefore this is the key thing. So anyone like listening who would be like Christians to this podcast might have this sort of feeling that Christianity is about, we have the relationship with Jesus. Islam is just laws and rules and following this sort of criteria of just you do this, and there's a distant God. Did you feel that is that the case? In fact, that with a lot of Muslims,
there's a certain amount of truth in that,
right?
I think that Christianity does seem to have more of an emphasis on a personal relationship with Jesus or with or with God, and that doesn't really exist in Islam. But there is a kind of I remember thinking, look, you don't need any intermediary between you and God in Islam. And this was something that is very much emphasized in Islam, that there is no intermediary between you and God, and you can express yourself directly to God, and God always hears as-Sami' al-Basir, which means he is all hearing and all seeing. He sees you all the time and he hears you all the time, and the Quran always does emphasize that God will answer the prayer of the one who calls upon him, and that he is closer to you than your jugular vein, and he is always around you, and though you can't see him, he can see you. These are all in the texts. So there I always felt that there was a kind of a personal relationship with God. I always had would not say a relationship with God, but I had a constant conversation with God. Yes.
Wow. That's certainly relational.
Yes. Yeah. And I think most Muslims do feel that. I don't think...
Was it a feeling of a two-way relationship? Or was it just you hear through the Quran and other scriptures and he hears through your prayers? It's
more that God is... speaking to you through the Quran and through your Islamic practices, and by doing your duty to God, you're sort of fulfilling that relationship, and that God will fulfill his part of the contract, if you like. And the Quran actually does emphasize that it is about a contract, and it often relates the stories of the Bani Israel, which are the Jews. And it describes them as having a covenant with God. And it very much kind of says that Muslims have this same covenant or contract, that if you follow the laws, if you follow what the Quran says and the dictates of Islam, God will protect you and guide you and eventually take you to heaven. So there was this feeling that there was this
that's very similar to the Jewish culture.
It is,
with
actually,
that
and I think
except no heaven in that particular point. It was more like the extended protection of your city and your generations prospering on an earthly setting. But the idea of this contract with God, I'll do this, you do that, gave you that blessing.
How does that become falsifiable? In that, presumably, Muslims all over the world have some terrible things happen to them, like their children getting diseases and stuff. And yet that doesn't make them think, oh, God's let me down, I'm no longer a Muslim.
Well, this is a good question. This is a very good question. I mean, most Muslims, if I try to put myself back in that mindset, what I would have said and what most Muslims would say is that God is testing you, and the more he loves you, the more he will test you, and the more he will put you through trials, and it shows that he loves you more and more, and you will get more reward for that. And the one who is patient, wasta'inu bis-sabri was-salah, and seek help through patience and prayer. And so there's this always that if this is happening to you, it's a kind of a blessing. Also, at the same time, the Quran also says that if anything bad happens to you, it's because of what your own hand has done. And so we say either God is trying us because he loves us, or I've done something wrong, or I should try harder to be a better Muslim. We make 101 excuses for God.
Yeah.
But eventually, I mean, that was one of the things that did kind of start to ring hollow for me. It started to, make me think, look, especially because the Quran actually uses this argument against the polytheistic gods of Mecca. And it says, look, there are verses saying, who is more foolish than one who worships gods who don't answer them? To the Meccans who were worshipping these idols. And of course, it doesn't take a huge step to think, well, does God actually answer prayers? And that was one of the ones that I started to ask in the end.
Yes.
But when you're in that moment of faith and zeal, you make excuses for God, and you see it in you turn it around into a positive way, that it's because God loves you, and He's going to give you more reward.
Francis, you were going to say something there?
No, I don't. I mean, what Christians normally say in these circumstances, I think, is, "Oh, God's not a slot machine, is He? You can't just put in the prayer and get get out of Him what you think you want." I
think Muslims would say similar things.
Yes. I think I imagine it's the same sort of response the world over, and you can normally find some way of reconciling it, rationalising it.
It's a very interesting thing there, what you said then, Hassan, though, about that scripture, or do you call it scripture, by the way, the Quran?
Yes.
Scripture. Saying that, these false gods don't answer, and then your God does. And then you start to think, actually, when he doesn't, you have to have a whole new set of answers to the concept of he doesn't. Like the slot machine, he's not a slot machine. He's not on call. He's not on tap. And he doesn't actually speak to you. Does he speak? He doesn't. Allah doesn't speak to you. Because, some critique of the Christian faith said to me, I heard him say, actually, prayer is amazing. I can understand it as a concept, but if God speaks back, you're schizophrenic. So Allah doesn't actually speak. Whereas many Christians, from my background, I mean, you could speak about Jesus as almost as if you've had a cup of tea and a morning break with him, chatting about the day, this, that, and the other, and what he wants you to do. This is very common within certain strands of Christianity. Would it have been yours, Ed?
Yes, that was the water I was swimming in, but it wasn't happening for me. And,
so God really wasn't, or you didn't feel he was speaking to you.
That's right. And actually that was the kind of trigger issue, or there were two, that made me step back and look at it all rationally.
Right.
So I think in all Christianity there is a certain degree that God, that it's not all just reading the Bible one way and
it's just like
saying
prayer,
the prayer the other,
and then no God. The God is listening but not speaking. Whereas I definitely grew up in a place where even people to missionary organisation I was in, it was at the level that if you were at a market stall even, and someone would say, the Holy Spirit would prompt you and say, I want you to buy that scarf, and it was, it's that level sometimes. It was extreme, I know, but the idea that this divine, it's a two-way conversation.
There were people like that in the church, and I kind of slightly rolled my eyes at it all. That's right. But
But it's fascinating, Hassan, to see that isn't the case. But it still parallels, say, a lot of some of the Catholic friend Christians that I've got sort of operate a bit like that with God. And it isn't the same as my Protestant charismatic background. So even then, in our faith, there's very different scenarios.
Yeah. But the dark night of the soul goes right pre-Reformation, doesn't it?
Yes.
So that's a sense that God's not there.
Yes, I see what you mean.
So there must be a sense that he is there when it's not a dark night.
Yes, good point. Very good point.
You might find the Sufis do have this idea that God is kind of speaking to them, especially some of their charismatic leaders actually claim not necessarily to be speaking to God. The idea of speaking to God is slightly blasphemous, or that God is speaking to you is slightly blasphemous in Islam. But the Sufis do have their sheikhs, some of them who are actually dead. I remember Sheikh Nazim claimed that he was speaking to a sheikh who was dead and who was giving him messages from the other side. And so some of them do claim some special knowledge and some special ability to...
So Sufis are like the more charismatic form of Muslims?
They're more esoteric. They're the ones who are more mystical. They have that more... They do things like dhikr, which is where they kind of get themselves into a state of almost trance-like state.
Pentecostals.
Yeah, there are lots, Andrew. There are.
There are a lot. Pentecostals and charismatics.
And they have this idea of being one with God, and that getting into this ecstatic state of being one with God.
Wow, totally.
Are they the ones who are the Sufis, the ones who are what used to be called when I was a child, and it may well be considered politically incorrect now, but they used to be called whirling dervishes? Would that
the whirling dervishes are one sect? Again, you see, like I say, Islam is not one homogenous entity. There are so many different types, and it's the same as Sufis. There are so many different types of Sufis, and there is a huge spectrum. The whirling dervishes, I think, originate in Turkey, where they've got. Is it the Naqshbandi? There's lots of different groups. No, it's not the Naqshbandi. I can't remember what group they are, but there are lots of different groups, and that particular group has become a tourist attraction because they obviously dress up and then they do all this whirling for the tourists. But it does hark back to the sort of halakas, which are the circles that they have, where they get into an ecstatic state of trying to, if you like, get away from the sort of temporal world and have this experience of oneness with God. And whirling around obviously is gonna make you quite dizzy, and you get you to that state.
Yeah. Anyway, I think we've taken you thoroughly off track. So we've heard how you became much more serious in your Islam.
So when I came back from Egypt, I really wanted to practice, and I got married. It was a kind of an arranged marriage. I started working at Islamia school, where I became a school teacher there, and this was the school that was started by Yusuf Islam, Cat Stevens.
Yeah.
And so I got to know him quite well there. I was a teacher there for 15 years.
I think I do remember something from your talk that struck me a lot, which I think you've skipped over. That is was it a weekend in Dewsbury or a much longer period?
Yes, you're right. I forgot about that. That was one of the early instances after I'd come back from Egypt. I was invited to go on what's called Jamaat Tablighi, which is basically they're a group that want to try and bring people back to the true path of Islam. And they originated actually in India, and they are quite big in the UK because most of the Muslims in the UK are from Asian backgrounds, India and Pakistan. And they've got a huge mosque in Dewsbury. They've got quite a few mosques in the north of England, especially, which follow this Tablighi style of Islam. And I was only just 19 then, and I was invited up to go up there, and we spent 2 weeks sleeping in the mosque. They were teaching us all the details. We weren't allowed to go out except to invite others to come, and we just learned all the sunnahs and all the practices. We had to do everything. I even had to sleep facing Mecca. I had to take water with 3 sips. These are all practices of the Prophet. We always had to enter with our right foot. It was every little detail. We had to brush our teeth with the miswak.
Brush your teeth with what?
Sorry, with the miswak. That's the Prophet used to. It's a sunnah, which there's a stick. I don't know what it's called. From a tree in Arabia, which they fray it at the end, and you brush your teeth with it. It was the 7th century toothbrush, I guess. But because the Prophet did it, it's now a sunnah, and it's a practice. And I remember in fact, during that Tabligh, they told us a story of a Muslim army that was trying to conquer some place, maybe Constantinople or something like that, and they couldn't breach the walls of the city, and so they got together and they said, "What are we doing wrong? We're doing all the sunnahs of the Prophet. We're following all the practices. We're following all the commands. We're doing everything." And then somebody said, "Wait a minute, we forgot to brush our teeth with the miswak. And that's the reason why we haven't been successful." So they brushed their teeth with the miswak, and then they managed to breach the walls and conquer whatever it was. So there was this huge emphasis on doing these tiny details. And I remember coming back from Dewsbury after the 2 week seclusion from the sort of this evil world, I was in a state of paranoia that there was this evil world outside, and I had to protect myself from it. And I was OCD about all these little practices that I had to do and so on. And I grew my beard. I used to wear jalaba. I used to always wear the cap, and it kind of just made me hyper religious.
But was it also a kind of bit of a high as well, of excitement of being in this amazing movement?
Well, it was indeed. I mean, you felt just totally cut off, and you suddenly felt that these things were so much important. I was so focused on the next world. I didn't care about this world at all anymore. It was just the next world I had to prepare for and work for, and I mean, I was really invigorated.
That's very similar to the missionary organization that I sort of joined, called Youth with a Mission, where it was like you was not so much not caring about this world, but it was like you wanted to evangelize and tell the truth to all the people in the world to get them to salvation. You know, it's very key that was your mission. And so I didn't start off doing like a normal job. I started off as a missionary at 18 or 19, or at least was involved in a group that was with that aim. Did you feel, the question that raises with me of the sort of things you just said, did you feel like privileged to have the truth?
Yes, I did. I felt very lucky and very fortunate, and I felt that it was my duty to pass it on and to tell others. I think that I felt a desire, a genuine desire that I loved others, and I didn't want them to go to hell, and I really wanted to save them. And I felt that all these nice people around me living in England, I don't want them to go to hell. I want them to go to paradise with me. And so, yes, I really felt...
That's so this is where it really hits me home, because I was the same. I was exactly the same. I lost sleep over everyone being lost to the Christian hell, particularly one version of it. And it was like, it's so weird that I never lost sleep over an Islamic hell at all. I didn't even think about it. This is one of the things when you were talking, and yet you kind of probably lost sleep over the Christians and non-Christians, or other people who are non-Islamic. I know Muslims seem to be split on whether Christians do go to the Muslim hell or not. It seems to me that's the case. But you lost sleep over people like me and Ed and Francis going to the Muslim hell, which I never lost any sleep of. I mean, I just can't get my head around that.
Yeah.
I always felt that you were so mistaken.
Yes.
You were nice people, but you just didn't know, and I needed to tell you. And I mean,
that's just what we were doing. That's just what we were doing.
And Islam gives you this very nice kind of story, which slots Christianity and Judaism into its sort of whole sort of worldview. So we say it's all Islam. Adam was a Muslim, Jesus was a Muslim, Moses was a Muslim.
Yes.
And they were saying the same message as Muhammad. But unfortunately, some people back in the day, they corrupted it.
Right. Trinitarianism came in, yes.
And now all these people are misguided. We've got to put it right.
Right.
Yeah.
So you're the ultimate renewal to the Abrahamic religion, and Christianity is the bastard offspring, probably through Paul or something. Yeah, I can see.
Oh, yes, we blame Paul
for everything.
An awful lot.
Trinity came later, and oh my
gosh. It's all made up by these people afterwards, yes.
And yet I was seriously told by people and imbibed that I sort of say as a teenager, what about Muslims and other religions? Oh, they're just deceived. It's so sad. So sad. That's why, Andrew, you need to be a missionary and go in to missionize Muslims and other people, because they need the truth, And so look at my mindset. It's the same as yours.
Yeah.
So, and again, it's that in-group bias, isn't it?
Yeah. When you say Paul was...
that's interesting.
Messed it all up. I thought the whole of the New Testament was the Injil, or is it just the 4 Gospels?
It's not very clear what the Injil actually means. Because the Quran...
Can you just translate the term Injil?
Okay, the Quran talks about the Injil, which is usually translated as the Gospels.
Okay.
But the Quran, when it speaks about the Injil, it appears to be speaking about a revelation which was given to Jesus, a book that was given to Jesus. Just as it speaks about a book being given to Moses and a book being given to Abraham. By the way, there's supposedly a book, and so it doesn't seem to seems to be a disconnect, because the Bible, the New Testament is obviously are the accounts of Jesus's life by other people, but the Quran doesn't seem to relate that. It seems to talk about the Injil as if it is a book that was revealed to Jesus.
Right, okay.
And then it says that the Jews and the Christians corrupted their books, and they introduced other things into it, and the original message, which was essentially the message of Islam, was lost and corrupted. But there does seem to be this, it seems that Muhammad perhaps thought that there was a revelation or a book similar to the Quran, because, see, the Quran is different from the Bible. The Quran is the literal word of God. It's the infallible, literal, verbatim speech of God. It's not Muhammad's words. It's not. It's not a retelling. It's not a description. It's the literal word of God. And when the Quran speaks about the Injil, it seems to be speaking about it in that same way, that it is a revelation from God to Jesus. When of course, historically, it's not. It's not quite the same thing.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
So, it's amazing how quick the time's going past. I'm sure Andrew's longing for you to start talking about how it all started to unpick.
Well, shall I get on to that then?
Yeah. Just before you do that, just carry on about the Quran a minute, because I think this is very interesting, because the Quran, you're saying, is the literal word of God, which is impinging. I know that Christianity, that isn't the case in the books, as in not the actual books of the Bible, but in this sort of, in the way that people talk on paper, so to speak. I mean, the Bible, you might think that about maybe some of Moses's narrations, that God wrote something on tablets and stone, and that's the literal word of God. But actually, as a whole, the Bible isn't seen like that, and yet fundamentalists often retract to the same kind of language. This is the word of God, Andrew. It's the infallible, inerrant word of God, as if it's this Quranic view.
I've noticed that, and I don't quite understand that, because I mean, it is actually inspired writers, isn't it?
It is. And so people do flip about on what they actually mean. And I know from being in the church for so long that actually, to be honest with you, it's not a lot different than what you just said. This is the literal word of God. Do not contradict the Bible. As if even Paul's language, when he doesn't remember something, I think I baptized somebody, I don't know. But that's still the inspired word of God, But nevertheless, I think that it still comes back to a lot of Christians thinking like you're talking about the Quran as the literal word of God. So in unpacking further as you move on about some of the doubts, it is, if you could sort of include what that literal word means, in the sense that I know that does that mean that the Quran is eternal? This sort of question. Does it mean that Arabic is like a heavenly language, and this, I find this fascinating as part of a journey.
I remember I used to have an Arabic teacher at the university. He was Palestinian, and he said, you have to learn Arabic, otherwise you won't be able to speak to anyone in Jannah, because paradise, because the language in paradise is Arabic.
Yeah.
Wow.
There was actually a debate in Islam, a big argument as to whether the Quran is eternal or created. And the Mu'tazilites, who were the rationalists, if you like, in the Middle Ages, argued that it was created. But the more traditional ones said, no, it's uncreated. And they actually won the day. And so mainstream, classical, traditional Islam insists that the Quran is uncreated, and that it has existed eternally with God. It is the speech of God. And as God is eternal, it is eternal.
Wow. Do you know, that's so parallel. This is one of the parallels with me that's so uncanny. That is so parallel to the Arian debate over Jesus, with the Arians were saying that actually we think Jesus was ultimately created, but the first creation, and is not actually eternal with the Father. And then they almost won out at one point. There seemed to be many of them. And then, but what really won out was actually Jesus was uncreated and eternal and one with the Father. Very, very similar split of concept there, except one's about a person of Jesus and the other's about the Quran.
It's interesting that the Quran speaks about Jesus as saying he is the word of God, Kalimatullah, which I've always found interesting.
Yeah,
that is
so Jesus concept. Is like the Quran. Jesus is kind of like the Quran.
Yes, certainly in the Arian debate, it even sounds more so, particularly as it could have gone historically the other way. Did you ever think that, gosh, if the others actually did win out and looked like they could be at one point?
It almost did. And
it's amazing.
And in fact, 700 and something, 750 around there, the Caliph Harun al-Rashid, I don't know whether you've heard of him, he's quite one of the famous caliphs in Baghdad. Right. He sided with the Mu'tazilites, and he made the Mu'tazilite doctrine of a created Quran and their rational beliefs as well. They had other quite rational beliefs. The orthodox, and he insisted that everybody follow it. And even his son and the next caliph also followed that doctrine as well. And they started to have what was called the mihna, which was a little bit like an inquisition, where they started testing some of the clerics to see if they were following the correct doctrine. And Ibn Hanbal, one of the famous leaders of the four schools of Islam, refused, and he insisted on the uncreatedness of the Quran. And he almost created, and it was a bad move by the caliph, because what it did, it created a backlash against authority, and a lot of more people sort of came around and supported the uncreatedness, and eventually the caliph had to abandon it, and the uncreated doctrine won the day.
That is so amazing. It so parallels Athanasius. He was the same one. There were sort of talks that he was the last one standing vocally for the uncreatedness of Jesus, with all these Aryans flying around. And there was people historically have thought, gosh, it could have gone the other way. And then it didn't. It built up, just like you just said for your story there, that actually Aryanism was suppressed and pushed out as that sort of more rationalistic lot. And then today seen as just heretics from this point of view, There
are so many parallels, really.
So many parallels. I see them everywhere now. Everywhere.
Yeah. Well, we'll get some more as we,
your doubts,
hear about the kind of bricks beginning to crack.
Share your doubts aloud.
Well, I think that I always say that, whenever you ask somebody, why did you either enter a religion or why did you leave a religion, they always give you rational reasons. But I always say, essentially, we tend to backward rationalize things. And I think that it often takes an emotional slap in the face. There are certain things that give you a different perspective. Because when I was in the bubble of Islam, I was very happy. I was emotionally happy. Everything was going well. I had my family. I had my job at Islamia school. I had my lovely children, my whole community, and everything was perfect. And so there was no reason to doubt. There was no reason to question. There was no reason to look at things from a different perspective. But when certain things started happening, and there were a few events, it just gave me that several slaps and punches, which kind of started making me not doubt Islam, but start to look at it from a different perspective. There was obviously 9/11 was one of the first ones, which I remember I was at Islamia school discussing, and obviously a lot of people, most Muslims were obviously aghast and saying this is a terrible thing to happen, but they would make excuses, like they would say, oh, it's America was behind it, or the Zionists were behind it, or it was a plot or something. But there were some sort of hardline Salafis who actually tried to justify it and say, well, they deserved it because they voted for the infidel system, they voted for the kufr system. And they started to give some examples from Quran and Hadith why it should be justified. And it just made me think, how could they possibly believe that such a terrible act could be justified by Islam? Islam is love and peace. It couldn't possibly be, justifying this sort of things. And then there was the breakup of my marriage, which was a big blow. There was the illness of my son. He had fallen in with some friends, actually, funnily enough, from Islamia school, which I'd sent him to be safe. And they'd been smoking cannabis, and he suffers to this day from schizophrenia, and that was a real blow. We'd also lost a child a little while before that. Then there were lots of these there was the Bali bombing, there was 7/7, there were several things, and it just seemed that at that time I was just constantly debating with people about things. I remember sitting in Islamia school staff room with all women teachers, and we were speaking about the verse that allows a man to hit a wife. And we had a Salafi sister who was defending it. And I said, look, under no circumstances can it be correct. I said this, it must, mean something else. And I tried to, say, oh, well, it doesn't really, it was trying to stop people at the time from doing it. And you should follow the Prophet's example, because the Prophet never hit his wife. And so it was to deal with those people at the time. And then there was also things about that a woman should get half the inheritance of a man. And I remember saying to all these women who were sitting around the table, I said, look, you're all working, you're all teachers, and you're all earning a living. Why should you get half, the inheritance of man, because they used to justify it by saying, well, the man has to provide. And I said, well, look, you're all providing. Things have changed.
Yeah.
And I was just seemed to be having one constant debate after another. And then there was the age of Aisha, 9 years old. And the more and more I kind of started to debate and discuss with other Muslims, the more that it was their responses that actually caused me doubt, because they just sounded so unbelievable. They weren't good responses.
This is like our apologists or something, apologists in Christianity, it's not doing it when they give an answer. Yeah. And so with the age of Isa, I presume they say, well, it wasn't 9. If you look at the Arabic word or something, I don't know this, but they'll probably say it means 13 or something.
That's what many of them said.
I don't even know that. I'm just guessing because I know what apologist mind is like.
Yeah, they said she was 18 or something.
Exactly. Maybe they dropped the 1 or something in an Arabic thing. Yeah.
And they also argue that, of course, the context argument. You've heard
yes.
that.
Totally.
Goodness, the context argument.
Matured earlier then, and it was different then, and they had to go straight out to work. There was no sense of childhood then. It was just either you're a child as soon as you started menstruating, and so on. And all of them just sounded too shallow. I just didn't buy it anymore. I was still a believing Muslim, and I still believed the Quran was the word of God.
Yeah.
But I said, look, I'm going to reevaluate. I'm going to look again at the Quran, because I want to answer these things. I want to answer them properly. I want to find the real good answer, because these answers that I'm hearing are not.
That's why I went to Bible college. Same reason.
But for you, Andrew, and I'm wondering for Hassan as well, that that the whole thing was barking up the wrong tree. It wasn't an option. You were looking at it to solve the problem, not to see if the problem made the whole thing.
It was. I really wanted to stay in my faith. I really wanted to.
So did I.
I wouldn't wish losing faith on anyone. It's a horrible experience. It's something that I didn't want to do, and it was scary. And I still, after
I'm the same.
I'm still struggling with some of the issues that it's left me with. It's very traumatic.
Yeah.
And I tried very, very hard to, and I actually went through a phase of being a reformist. I was calling for a reform of Islam. We need to reevaluate some of the issues in the Quran. We've got to understand it's metaphorical. Many of them just apply to their context. I even went, just before I completely left Islam, I even went to the stage where there were some scholars like Abdul Karim Saroush and a couple of others, Saeed Nasheed, who were saying that the Quran is the word of it's the inspired word of God, but it is articulated by Muhammad, and it's like he said that it's like when God gives the baker makes the grain grow, but he takes the grain and he grinds it and he adds water and he makes it into flour and then he makes it into bread in the way he wants. He said this is how the revelation came to Muhammad, that it was in ideas and concepts, and it's Muhammad who articulated them according to his time and his context. And so I was really struggling hard to try and make sense of this.
That is so similar, though. It's so similar. We reference a guy called Peter Enns, a very sort of progressive Christian, talks about the Bible now in those kind of ways, as opposed to the way that the fundamentalists would say, or Protestants traditional, about the Bible. And a lot of people find it more at home to go there with all the issues if they want to stay in the faith. And I did. And so I was just going that way, but finding it harder and harder as I was moving, because it was even those answers weren't satisfying, because then it raises a whole new set of problems. And you probably found the same thing, Hassan, that this reformist way was helpful in one sense, and yet also raising a whole new banner of questions.
I think that it gets to a point where I wanted to stay in the religion, and I wanted to keep all the the comfort, the meaning, the direction, the identity that it gave me. And I was so scared of losing all of that. And so my desire to stay in was allowing me to accept some of these apologetics. But it was getting thinner and thinner and thinner and thinner. And then it got to the point where I just couldn't accept them anymore. Even though I wanted to stay in the faith, I couldn't believe it. I just couldn't. Yeah. And the thing is, you can't pretend to believe. And it's very soul destroying to go along with things that you genuinely inside don't believe.
Yeah, no, I think Ed,
some people do.
It depresses you.
I think your question, Ed, to both of us was that it was almost unthinkable to think the obvious from your point of view, that maybe none of it's true. It's true.
Well, with me, when I looked into it, it was definitely an option that I was aware it could lead in that direction.
Right. Whereas
I didn't want it to.
It was unthinkable for me. There must have been a version, when I went to Bible college, it was a version of Christianity that I was trying to peel the onion layers off of all this nonsense, and I'm going to get to the pristine truth. And until I realized the onion layers obviously just kept going till there was nothing. But I led a house group where I was teaching, and this is a point you made, Hassan, the people in the house group about stuff. And I realized, as I found this so hard, I didn't really believe what I was saying. I was trying to help them, but I was so doubting everything, I had to leave the group because I thought it's so unfair, because I don't believe a word I'm saying, and yet I'm trying to help them with all these different ideas and views.
Sometimes in spite of yourself that you try to do something, but you can't stop yourself coming out with what you really feel and what
yeah.
Can we sorry, I was going to ask Hassan if we could come on to talk about some of the difficult verses. I mean, you've mentioned one which is about beating your wife. I wondered if you could talk about some others. I mean, unless you want to move it on to some other direction, Ed.
Well,
that'd be great.
Yeah, what you could do, Hassan, is you could say, try and, you've talked about this reformist kind of thing where you were going, which is, I could see as more what we call progressive Christianity in our circles, and the more fundamentalist. And what both of those, because it seems to me from the talk you gave, say on that particular verse, which is a great example of the struggle you were going through, that actually you found that that there was more or less a clear understanding, and it was just the reformists were almost like trying to get away from it. And yet on the other hand, you couldn't accept the literalistic understanding of it either. So you were torn. I understand that. So if you just go through that.
To be fair, I think that there is flexibility in understanding the Quran. I think some critics say that, the true Islam is the Islam of ISIS. That's not absolutely true. ISIS are quite selective. And they pick the verses that suit them, and they interpret them in the way that suits them. But the progressives also are extremely selective, and they frankly delusional in the way that they interpret some of the verses. So what is Islam? As I always say, it's not just one thing. There are different ways to interpret it, and there is scope for different interpretations. But mainstream classical traditional Islam, is still there are things in there which you just can't get around. You can't excuse. The verses about hell, for example, that was number one. That really, that was the final nail in the coffin for me. And I said, I simply cannot accept that. Hell is eternal in the Quran. It's detailed very graphically.
More than the Bible,
much more than the Bible. In fact, I don't know of any other holy book where it is detailed in such great detail, where skin being roasted off and placed, and hook rods of iron stripping your skin off, and boiling water poured into your mouth, and your intestines shredded, and your
Did you believe that?
Your brain's boiling and.
But okay, back in the early days, like early 80s, did you believe that?
I used the metaphor example, and I kept saying, it's just a metaphor, and it's a metaphor for the pain you will feel for hurting others.
Right. Okay. Well, there's a Christian view like that.
But the metaphor argument doesn't work, because what does a metaphor mean? It means describing something in language, to help you to understand it better. And when you've got this incredibly graphic, detailed descriptions of this horrible, terrifying, most disgusting torture. What can it be a metaphor for?
Well, only that it's worse than that.
Exactly.
Exactly.
I mean, okay, let's say it's not literal. Spiritual, that's probably worse.
Yes, it's much worse. It's only it's the physical metaphors that make it so
mental, that's probably worse.
Torture chamber.
There's no getting round it. And when that penny dropped for me, and it took a long time, because you see, when you're willing to make excuses, your mind will. But when finally I wasn't willing to make any more excuses, and the penny dropped, it just blew my mind. I thought, there's no way I can possibly believe. How can you believe? And the Quran describes God as Arhamar Rahimin, the most merciful of the merciful.
Yes. Yeah. I had the same experience. Yeah.
Who is God comparing himself to here? Because I know a hell of a lot of more merciful people than that.
Yes, that's very true. That'd be interesting on your take, Francis, on something like that. The hell thing.
Well, the idea about it being metaphorical. I mean, that certainly rings bells with the way that a lot of Christians will say that it's a metaphor for separation from God, the agony you will feel at being separated from God. But yes, I mean, I think that you're absolutely right, Hassan. Agony is agony, whether it's physical agony or spiritual agony, it's still agony. And why is it being inflicted on people, particularly people who, on some religious approaches, are guilty of nothing more than having made a mistake, having made a genuine mistake. And it's very hard to understand how an eternity of agony could be justified on any understanding of what is meant by justice, let alone mercy. I mean, mercy is supposed to mitigate justice, but it doesn't even seem to be justice. Just,
Absolutely. It always struck me that even if Islam was true, how could you possibly justify this punishment? And then I thought, well, actually, it almost seems that God's actually turned the signposts around. He's actually made it difficult for people to believe things. Instead of leaving the evidence very clear, he's chosen to make it confusing and to allow competing claims.
Yes.
It's almost as if he's tricking us.
Yeah. I could be at the judgment and they're saying, hey, I joined a missionary organization to try and evangelize the world to stop them going to the Christian hell. And all of a sudden I'm now finding that Allah and the Muslim hell is for me.
Exactly.
Gosh, that doesn't seem...
And it seems that God doesn't understand in-group bias and groupthink and how people are brought up in cultures and through no fault of their own, through no lack of virtue, they've followed the wrong path.
God might need some psychology and sociology.
When I was trying to sort of save people from hell, I had no concept in my kind of actual practical thinking that they were in deep rebellion against God and were choosing to ignore him, and the suffering they were lining up for was something that was justified. It in my mind, it was like this big calamity that is coming on all of us, and I've got this fortunate escape just through because I happened to hear the right thing at the right time, and I'm desperate for other people.
And you would have been quite in shock then, Ed, at the judgment to find out that actually the hell that Hassan believed in was the real one for you.
Yeah, that would have been quite...
that would have been quite... This is the reality when you start to think like that. And it's like, oh my gosh, it's like you're all... In one sense, what we're saying is that lots of people they think that they're doing the best and believing the truth. And it's just, I would have thought that as a Christian, I would have thought it's so unfair for someone like Hassan to go to the Christian judgment in a negative sense, because he is only following what he thought was true. And the lifestyle would have reflected that. And it just seems so like Hassan. So it's just the same thing as you, Hassan. It's exactly the same problem.
And one of the things I didn't like was that you were almost forced to try and attribute nefarious intentions to others in order to make that make sense, because you couldn't possibly accept that God, the most merciful of the merciful, would send nice people to hell. So they must be evil. They must be horrible.
Yes.
And so you ended up trying to discredit people all the time. And that's I felt horrible. I couldn't do that. And that's why, you often see Muslims or Christians or whatever doing that to us, because otherwise they find it difficult to reconcile.
Yeah.
Yes, I get that. Oh, sorry.
So when I deconverted, to me, the thing that struck me hardest, it was wonderful, was this sense of connection I had with people, because up till then they were going to hell and they were rebelling against God, and there was this enormous gulf between me and them, and my relationship with them was sort of purposed on, according to my faith, saving them, not appreciating them as a fellow human.
It's like you're sitting next to someone of a different order of being. you could be having a meal and joking and talking about the weather and the football, but actually you're on this course in the afterlife and they're on that one. And it's an in and out group scenario, even though you've got the passion to get them to join your group. Yeah. It makes that conversation much more less than human, I feel.
Yeah, just
there's no solidarity there.
Connection is just not possible between one human and another when you're in these two different camps.
Exactly.
So for the two, Andrew and Ed, for the two of you, there was at least one positive to losing your faith. What about you, Hassan? Did you experience something like that? That there was a positive to losing your faith?
What they were just talking about. I remember saying to someone afterwards when I kind of lost my faith, it felt I could look at people in the eye, anyone in the eye, and be absolutely honest and almost accept them exactly as they are and say exactly how I feel. For once, I didn't have to check everything by a book. I didn't have to check what I was thinking or saying.
Yes.
I could just be me. I could just my conscience. And all of a sudden, all the things that I, had kind of, as I say, you try to attributed nefarious tensions. All that just washed away, and I suddenly, as you say, I felt part of humanity. I felt that those divisions were gone. That was a tremendous positive feeling.
Then you can embrace other people's views that I've found, that even though they're vastly different anyway, you can just say that we've all got different views, but this traditional view of hell doesn't hang on the balance of being right. It just means I want to learn more. Oh gosh, I didn't realize that, and that's interesting perspective. And you can actually get on as humans better than this divide. I've certainly felt that for myself.
Yeah,
absolutely. I think there were suddenly humanity became my family.
Yes, I get that.
Yes, exactly. It's brilliant.
And I included everybody, and I included Muslims, and I included everyone, because I still feel massive empathy towards Muslims, and I if you look at any of my videos, I'm always trying to speak nicely to them, because I have love and empathy for them, and I have love and empathy for the whole of humanity.
Yes.
And I'm not part of any group anymore.
Yeah.
Yes, I get that totally.
Great.
Yeah.
We do need to move on to what we've been promising our listeners to do this month, and that is to answer the question we were asked in the I think the previous London Unbelievable group, and that is why we're so engaged still with religion, having left it. Particularly directed at Andrew and myself. And Hassan, you included an amazing answer to that from your perspective when you came to the group.
Yes, it set us all off on thinking we need to answer this ourselves. So yes, if you go ahead, Hassan, on that.
I actually can't remember what I said, but I think it was Mark Twain who said, "Never lie," and then so you don't have to remember anything. Anyway, so I think I mean, one of the main reasons is that I feel I need to speak for those people who can't speak. There are lots of people in the Middle East, in my father's country, Egypt, and so on, who are being persecuted, who are suffering, who are not able to express themselves. And there are many people in Europe as well, in close-knit communities, who are not able to speak. And so I'm in a position where I came from a fairly liberal family, and I don't really have any threats. I'm not really in any danger, so I'm able to speak. I feel it's kind of my duty to say something and to criticize religion in a sane and rational and calm way, without creating more division, but to try and bring people together. I always say that, I was a school teacher for 30 years, and I was always taught that you don't teach children what to think, you teach them how to think. And I've always felt that it's, I don't want to change, I'm not trying to turn anyone, but I want to give people the opportunity to hear an alternative view, because many people don't get that chance, and to make their own informed decision. So, and to express my own opinions as well, of course. And it also has been a cathartic process for me as well, to kind of examine why, I went through this and what was the reason, and to try and heal my own, the issues that I've been left with. So I would say those are pretty much the reasons. Was that what I said in the meeting? I can't remember.
I think what struck me from what you said in the meeting was that point about how other people not having a voice.
Yes,
that's one of the drivers for me. And I just made a video actually about how to cope with religion after faith. And that's because I still get huge amounts of messages from people saying, please help me. You've sort of been through this. I went through the depression, and I went through suicidal thoughts and so on. So I feel almost like, well, I've got a little bit of set of knowledge, which I can see there's a new wave of people coming. I've got a duty to kind of like offer a little bit of advice.
Brilliant. Can you give us some links to that before we move on?
Yes. My YouTube channel is under my full name, which is Hassan Radwan. Sorry, I've got a little bit of a cold. It's HASSAN for November, and then RADWAN. If you look up on YouTube, you'll find my channel. It's got my face on it and my name, Hassan Radwan.
Okay, that's great. Obviously, it'll be in the show notes.
Okay.
Yeah. So I was going to just say, shall I say mine then?
Yeah.
Is that on the thing? Yeah. Okay. Right. So yes, because this question came up from when you spoke, Hassan, at the thing, and I was walking back with Steve, who's also been on this podcast a few times and is an integral member of the group. And he asked me afterwards. He said that was the definitively best question, and then he sort of turned it to me and said, "Well, why did
Andrew? Just out a bit of fun. It really was the month before. We were talking last month about how our memories fail us.
Yes.
Either I'm completely wrong or you're completely wrong. But I have very clear memory. It was the month before.
Month before what?
We had to defend our worldview and took it in turns. We put on the hot seat and be grilled.
Oh yes. Oh no. I'm talking about.
And it was then that we got asked, and you had the chat with Steve Tompkins on the way home. I'm sure it was the month before. Anyway, one of us has got a terrible memory.
My memory is walking back with Steve from. Right. Okay. Right. Okay. No. I think you're right. You think you're right. Is the one before? And Steve,
it really doesn't matter. I'm being pedantic. But it is.
Be glad that I wasn't. Yeah, I would say to that. Be glad that I wasn't a gospel writer, because that just shows you, doesn't it? What did Jesus do? Well, I think it was. Yeah. Okay.
Anyway, carry on.
Okay. You're absolutely right. Yeah, that's right. It just proves my point for gospel things. I've lost the track now. Yes. Okay. My particular thing, when Steve asked me that, I gave such a different answer to probably what Ed would give, and what even Steve was surprised about. And I said that I think, and so the question basically is why do we do what we do right now? Why don't you go off and, I don't know, play football or just do anything else and just sort of keep away from it all? Well, first of all, I believe that anyone that has that long form of Christianity, as Frankie Schaeffer, the son of Francis Schaeffer, said, you are a bit like a sober alcoholic. You're a sober evangelical. Your brain waves, your intuitions, everything is still very much formed part of the faith. And so somehow you almost can't help but be almost still attached to everything, even if you don't believe anything. I mean, it's a weird concept, but I love the Bible in a way. I see it so differently as a human book. I find it fascinating. But I suppose the biggest draw, I would say, is that I've found that my fundamentalist upbringing is quite damaging and actually unhealthy for life. And it's not like, anything about religious faith that's wonderful. It seems to be working and, in a sense, tapping into those humanist things, I'd say. That's great. But anything that's actually withholding that is quite damaging. And I feel that views of hell on children, for example, the tradition, they need to know about the differences within the faith on hell and how a lot of Christians struggle with it. And there's different ways to go. And I think that my interaction, say, with Beth, who emailed into the podcast, I have found that my interaction with sending materials to her wasn't to say, you need to land where I've landed. You need to just, obviously, you've had big issues with fundamentalist Christianity. And this is why it's damaging. This is why it's not healthy. And here's some other Christians that have gone on from that. And here's some agnostics that have gone right on from that. And so I find it, my particular impulse is to really help people say it's okay. These doubts are okay. They're normal. It's your humanity is trumping some of the silliness, as Hassan would have said. It's a bit silly, some of these views, and so that would be my motivation. It's a form of either helping other people, but also there's still a strong connection to the all things faith, because it's my entire life. And so I live in that sort of incredible agnostic world of Christianity. So Hassan, you'll probably identify with this. So yeah.
Absolutely. I actually said some of the similar sort of things that you know, there. Oh, sorry, I suddenly lost track. Somebody was asking me, why is it so difficult that you go through this trauma? And I said, it's because we were religious.
Yes.
It's because we were brought up with these myths. It's because we were protected from some of the harsh realities of life ever since we were little.
Absolutely.
And we've used this comfort blanket and we've wrapped ourselves in it. And for so long, when somebody has dragged or when we've lost our faith, it's much harder to then cope with some of the things that people have been coping with all their life, because they learned earlier, and that's why it's much harder for those of us who were deeply religious.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. So Ed, your particular thing then.
I answered this in a blog, so I'll give a link to it. It's the Tipling's Philosopher on Patreon, or Patreon, whatever it's called, run by Jono down from Portsmouth, who's a kind of in the British scene of kind of atheists and talking all this through. Anyway, so I was a guest blog on that, and I'll do a link to it. And I answered in two ways. The first one, harping right back to it's come up a lot in the discussion, and that is how what we want and what's rationally the case are two completely different things. So, and brain science has confirmed this, that you do something and then your brain rationally justifies it after. So you decide to stay in the faith of your upbringing, and then you rationalize it after with all this not particularly convincing apologetics when you're having doubts. But that's sufficient because of the drive. That what's really controlling the show is the subconscious, what you just need to believe and do. So we're sneaky, and we tell ourselves lies really as to why we're doing things. So in this blog I was saying, well, this is the reasons why I've decided to engage and start the Doubts Aloud podcast. That was the occasion for it. It was done around about our first episode. But really, you shouldn't believe a word I say, because it's my rationalization on top of the underlying, more deep-seated drives that maybe I don't even have full access to. So you have talked about that, Andrew, well, both of you really, about there are reasons because of your upbringing, things that you kind of can't drop it in a way.
Yes.
And I think in Hassan's case, the rationalization is a lot more valid than anything I could come up with, because it's such a big and serious issue that people can't engage in the sort of free discussion in the same way that Christians can. I reckon there's more barriers to being able to think through your faith in the Islamic world than there is in the Christian world. But I did go on to add my attempt at my rationalization, and I went for this WK Clifford thing that is definitely one of my things. Francis is very familiar with me bashing on about Clifford.
No, it's interesting.
And actually, I was on Unbelievable. Last time I was on Unbelievable, I really went down that road, sorry, not route. And so I don't really want to repeat stuff that people probably will listen to, because we hope that our listeners are Unbelievable listeners. But the aspect of what Clifford was saying that I think is so important is that you can't separate what you believe from what you do. So in a very kind of crass case, if you believe in spreading the gospel, you're going to spend your charity money on Bibles and missionaries. And if you are more of a humanist in your beliefs, so you're going to spend your charity money on more direct international aid with supplying water or education or all those other things. So that's just one example, but it runs so deep through everything that what we do is based on our beliefs. So our decision to be moral is one thing, but how we implement that and act morally in the world is as much affected by how we understand the world to be and all the rest of it. So what we believe really does matter, and engaging in that discussion matters from that point of view.
Yes. I mean, another thing I would just add to mine would be the fact that the Bible and Christendom has been it's so much fabric of society in terms of many parts of the world. And you probably say that the same, Hassan, in sense that actually that you're engaging with people all the time who are also engaging, even though they don't know it, with Christendom stuff and assumptions and principles. And so to me, to study more about the Bible, find out where it really came from, understanding about early polytheism and Israelites, what really did they come from, and myths, I find it so helpful to people to know, or at least have a discussion about knowledge than just assumptions. And therefore, it's just imparting and learning. It's a wide open learning experience between me and other people around these issues that are just corporately there. So it's not just me banging on about with an axe to grind. It's more engaging with the real world, similar to what you just said, Ed, whatever. So.
Okay, now France has got a different take. Will be a bit of a freshness on all of this.
For me, it's just a hobby. Everybody's got to have a hobby.
Love it. I love it. Just a hobby. I love it. That you couldn't get so vast a difference as that, could it? Yeah.
Yes, that's right. But I reckon it might well be a hobby for me. I just don't want to admit it.
No, it's not a hobby for me. I think Hassan, I would venture to get. I think you hinted at this anyway. That you kind of would be still so fascinated about Quranic studies and different ideas of how it came about. And
100%.
Yes, and when you said that was the biggest point that I thought. Yes, why do you still love the Bible? Well, I do, but it's just a different book now. It's a different historical thing of how it came about and what it means.
I actually enjoy the Quran more now.
I do.
I honestly do. And
Bible,
when I was at university, I studied all the tafsirs, which are the commentaries, the exegesis. And those guys were geniuses. They were brilliant. The things they came up with, the funny stories they came out with, the intricate arguments they created and concocted. I just love reading that stuff.
Yeah, and now, of course, if you found that you can actually go, this is what actually goes right back to your point, Ed, the idea that it's unthinkable that it's not true in that sense that you've been taught, and so you will go anywhere apart from that obvious thing because it's just not on your radar. Now you can look at it and go, well, that clearly is different from that. And if that's a different writer, that makes so much sense. Oh, that reflects the 7th century warrior sort of warfare kind of language of battles. Totally fits the period and not this uncreated Quranic word from you. I'm just projecting into you there, Hassan. But for me, it's like, oh yes, so God doing all the genocides and everything else was how they thought of gods at the time. So it fits the standard warrior God, and that makes so much more sense to me than this is Jesus in his pre-Christian state. I mean, whatever. So is that not true? Would you not think like that? You're so freer now to look at the Quran. You're not bound by it.
Absolutely. I always say that if I was to judge Muhammad by his own criteria and his own claims, I would have to judge him very, very harshly.
Yes.
But now that I realize that he is a 7th century man with a 7th century mentality, and the Quran is a fallible human work, I can judge it much kinder.
Yes, I did exactly the same. So I feel I probably be more close to you like that on the Bible than perhaps Ed you are on the Bible. In that sense, because we do have quite different stories in that sense. So I really do identify with that. I think if somebody said to me, "Why do you like the Bible?" I'd say, "Ask Hassan why he likes the Quran." That's right. Yeah. That's right. So that's fascinating. And do you think, Ed, then it would be good to wrap up, but actually to go to that specific thing that Francis asked, which was actually to do a specific and to do the famous verse on the just to go over those principles that when you had that on that famous verse about, was it beating
your wife one?
I think this is so fascinating because a lot of non-Muslims actually hear of this, and it's funny, it's unfair really, isn't it? But they say, Islam, isn't that where you're allowed to beat your wife? It's a terrible thing to say as your point of contact with Islam, but I've had people say that actually.
And the thing is that what a lot of Muslims will say is that you're just picking and choosing the horrible verses, and there's so many nice verses.
I haven't heard apologists say that. Gosh.
But the thing is that it does say that, and the Quran clearly says. I mean, it's وَاللَّاتِي تَخَافُونَ نُشُوزَهُنَّ فَاعِذُوهُنَّ وَاهْجُرُوهُنَّ فِي الْمَضَاجِعِ وَاضْرِبُوهُنَّ. So it says those women who you fear rebellion, in inverted commas, whatever that means,
yes.
First of all, speak to them, explain to them, talk to them, and then if that doesn't work, well, it actually just says and. So, but it's usually thought of as a series of steps.
Right.
If that doesn't work, then separate in bed from them, and then if that doesn't work, then hit them. Wadribuhunna, hit them. It literally says hit them.
Hit them. Yes.
Now, I'm using the word hit, which is a kind of a neutral word.
Yes.
Some translations actually say beat, which implies a stronger thing. But what the apologists do, what I used to do, I actually wrote an article for a Dawah magazine back in the day, and I argued, look, it only means a light hitting or a light beating, because the Prophet said that it shouldn't be harsh, and the scholars have said it shouldn't be on the face, and it shouldn't cause any cuts or bruises, and it should only be the third step if the first two, and normally the first one should work, so you should never do such a thing, and a separation should work, and so it should never get to that stage. But
the Quran doesn't actually say all that.
No. This is all the apologetics. This is all the apologetics. and then you say, well, you shouldn't actually hit your wife, and the Prophet never actually hit his wife, so you should follow his example, and so on. So it amounts to a virtual ban. And then, of course, people would come back and say, well, why does it say it then?
In the first place.
Well, why didn't it ban it then? Well, why didn't it ban it then?
Yes.
And you just be squirming in your seat to try and find the apologetics and answers.
Wow.
And
you're saying that the verse that says to actually hit, if it's literalized, is actually ultimately interpreted as a ban on hitting.
Some people apologize. Some apologists will go that far. Others will say it's only a light tap with a little toothstick, as I say.
Right, so that's another direction.
I remember I gave this example before. It's when you actually think about that, like, because you'll hear a lot of Muslims say that now. They'll say, "Oh, it's only a light tap on the shoulder with a toothstick." Just think about it.
To me, it's funny. I must admit. I'm sorry.
Your wife has done this awful rebellion. So you say, listen, I'm going to talk to you about this. I don't want you to do this anymore. I don't want you going out or not putting makeup or whatever it is. And that didn't work. So you separate. You go to separate, or she goes to her auntie or whatever, and you're in separate rooms. That didn't work. And so you say, okay, darling, I just want you to stand still for a while, and I'm going to tap you a few times with this tiny little stick on your shoulder, because to make you understand. And so she says, yeah, when you talked to me, it didn't make any sense. When we separated in bed, it didn't make any sense. But now that you've lightly tapped me on my shoulder, it just all makes sense.
Yeah.
I now see the error of my ways.
I mean, can you imagine going to a marriage guidance counsellor and sitting and you've talked about all your things, and the marriage guidance counsellor said, well, the husband says, I've tried everything. And so she says, well, have you tried tapping her on the shoulder with a little stick?
But do you know the way my mind works in today's age anyway, that the massive elephant in the room is let's just argue that it's a little tiny stick. And I'll mention that you need to mention that one other thing about that, almost the most ridiculous interpretation, I would say. But the elephant in the room is that why didn't the Quran say, and equally, likewise, women, if your husband is rude or whatever, slap him.
No, that's what I was thinking. It's all about the man.
It's all about the man.
The man having to teach the woman.
That's the elephant in the room.
By the way, there is a verse in the Quran which says that if the man is doing nushuz, which is the same word, rebellion, and it says that the woman can come to an agreement with her husband to make peace. And that's all it says.
Oh,
really?
And the tafsirs, the commentaries say that means she can give up some of her rights.
Well, okay, so not to be tapped on the shoulder, perhaps.
So, I mean, can you see the huge
yes,
gulf?
Yes.
So the woman has to accommodate the woman's option is to accommodate herself to the man's rebellion,
exactly.
Whereas the man's option is to put a stop to the rebellion.
But Islam is the religion of women's rights, didn't you know?
Oh, I have heard that, yes. Yes, and I've heard once about how property was allowed to a woman under Islam a long time before it was allowed to women in the West. I mean, I must have heard it.
The astonishing...
Well, I won't say 100 times, but...
ability to sort of, this... what's the word? Look, confirmation bias. It's that word where you cognitive dissonance.
Yes.
That huge cognitive dissonance, that because that's your in-group, you're going to make excuses for it. Everyone does.
Yeah. And there's an obvious one. And what's the most extreme interpretation of that hitting passage?
Well, a lot of some of the classical scholars say, well, you can, hit them, and you can hit them with a whip. And there's a hadith about saying, keep a whip in your house where your wife can see it. And
that would have been very interesting in my household.
And there are some companions who did beat their wives with sticks. And so, and you can hit them with your hand, according to some classical scholars. But the majority of scholars that you'll find alive today, none of them will say that. They will try to soften it.
So have you found that that's the spirit of the age has caught up with the Quranic plain verses?
Absolutely. And to be honest, to be fair, I always say that religions do evolve, and even if the religious people deny it, you can clearly see there has been some evolution. I think it's been quite hard for Muslims because of the nature of their belief in the verbatim word of the Quran to kind of bend the rules. But there has been definitely, without doubt, and the majority of ordinary Muslims have their own personal interpretation, which would probably, if they were to tell one of the sheikhs, would be regarded as heretical, maybe. But that's the nature of belief.
I was hoping that you'd mention the feather extreme, because I thought that was just so. We have our own apologetic versions of similar things, but the feather. If you just explain that, I think that's just fascinating.
Well,
then
we'll wrap up.
There are some people say you can use a little toothstick, or you can use just a feather or a handkerchief. Another one is a handkerchief, and it always reminds me of that Monty Python sketch of the slapping the fishes.
Yes, the German, the fish dance.
I can just imagine a Muslim household with a giant feather on the wall.
That'll teach you.
That'll teach you. Yeah. Get it. Whatever. But yeah, fascinating. I think that's absolutely fascinating. I'm sure other people would want to talk further if we had time about the 72 virgin scenarios and various.
There's loads.
But I think the picture of what your grapes, the grapes instead of 72. I'll have grapes, thank you. And that goes back to, is it a snapshot of the male 7th century views of what paradise might be like to have virgins? That's the kind of thing I would think.
I've never understood this obsession with virgins.
Somebody once said to me, never mind about 72 virgins, give me one woman who knows what she's doing.
I love it.
I don't have particularly pleasant memories of when I was a virgin, and I certainly wouldn't want to go to that again.
Yes, it's so fascinating, isn't it? Gosh, we don't have that in Christianity. I don't think there was ever that offer. That kind of sort of offer. But anyway, yes, we need to. Time is
time is against us.
Time is against us, and it's been amazing. So, any sort of recapping thoughts, Hassan, about today?
Just thank you so much for having me. I've really enjoyed it.
We searched for your YouTube channel, Hassan Radwan.
Yes,
and you're going to put it in the show. Oh, notes. Great.
Yes,
excellent.
That's great. And I would just want to say thank you very much. It's been such an enjoyable and interesting interaction, both in the Unbelievable Meeting and in this podcast. And I think anyone listening knows that this podcast stretches further than Christian talk, because it's engaging. And our next podcast, in fact, will actually be further on this subject. It's going to be another fascinating one. So that's this is the 2020 podcast. So I hope it's a happy new year for everybody.
Yes, and thank you again, Hassan. And I wish you a happy new year.
And you too.
Brilliant. Thank you, Hassan. Thanks very much. And so we'll see everybody next time. I've been Andrew, your host, along with Ed and Francis, and our very special guest, Hassan Radwan.